Good afternoon. Here we are, next topic in ecology, energy flow through an ecosystem. You've probably learned in middle school about food chains and probably a bit about food webs. Our focus in this class will be reviewing that and getting a bit deeper into what's actually happening at the chemical level and why does it all matter. So let's start with just looking at these two graphics. We've got a food chain, we've got a food web. What's the difference? Well, pretty obvious. The web's got a bunch of lines. The food chain just follows one path that energy could take. So what we're focusing on in this class is that there's energy contained in these organisms. And ultimately that energy comes from the sun and it flows through an ecosystem and is eventually lost as heat. So animals at the bottom of a food web or food chain are going to be called autotrophs or primary producers. And so autotrophs means they make their own food. And typically what we think of here are plants. So organisms that can use energy and sunlight, aka doing photosynthesis, to convert water and carbon dioxide into glucose or food. So plants are going to need to obtain water and sunlight to basically produce their own food. And that process is critical for life on Earth because it allows other organisms to consume the plants, because the only organisms that can actually get light from the sun are plants. And so we need plants. The more plants we have, generally the better and more productive an ecosystem. Autotrophs are also called producers because they produce all of the food that heterotrophs use, which we'll talk about in just a second. So key idea here, no autotrophs, no life. They are the link between harnessing energy from the sun and providing the foundation for a food web. So here's a couple pictures of autotrophs. So here's just a common plant. You can see the big leaves here. So on the plant leaf are chloroplasts, which are organelles in the plant cell that do the job of photosynthesis and convert that sunlight into food, which then they eat and then they obtain energy from it indirectly. So there's actually, the plants don't eat the sunlight. It doesn't work like that. We'll get into that. Here we have some algae. We talked a lot about algae in our first unit, so they're really important. We focused on algae as kind of being a bad thing. When there's too much of it, when it covers a lake like this, it blocks the sun, leads to that process of eutrophication we talked about. But in small amounts, algae is actually a good thing because aquatic organisms eat the algae. It forms the basis for the food chain in a lake or a river. Besides being a plant, there is one other form of autotroph you need to know about, and these are chemotrophs. Chemotrophs are organisms who have somehow adapted to areas where there's no sunlight. So deep in the ocean, at the bottom, the sunlight doesn't make it down there. And how can we have a thriving biological community at the bottom of the seafloor? Well, what we have are these chemotrophs. So these are organisms, mostly bacteria, that are able to chemically synthesize their own food. It's an interesting process. So they take stuff like salt from the ocean and they convert it into energy through some pretty interesting pathways. But those are pretty much the exception and not the rule. So what eats the autotrophs? Those are the heterotrophs. So heterotrophs have to get their food from somewhere else. They can't make their own food. So we're an example of a heterotroph. We have to eat stuff. We can't just sunbathe and fill our tummies. And there's lots of different kinds of heterotrophs or consumers. And we'll we'll talk about primary consumers versus secondary consumers. A really important distinction between those two, and basically that's herbivores versus carnivores or omnivores. So all sorts of organisms can be lumped into this heterotroph. I mean, if you're not a plant, you're basically a heterotroph. So we've got rabbits, deer, mushrooms. What are mushrooms eating? Well, they're decomposers, and we'll talk about them a little more. They're eating decaying organisms like rotting logs. The plant's dead. As the log rots, you might see some mushrooms there. Or in my grass, actually, I have mushrooms that are growing because I have some decaying grass that has allowed the mushrooms to begin to eat it and break it down. So there's a nice white-tailed buck for all you hunters. Get you excited for hunting season. Oh, and there's the rabbit, and there is the mushroom. Oh, nice. Okay, so consumers, there's a few types we need to talk about here. Scavengers / detritivores / decomposers. This is kind of the most confusing part of all this, where they fit into an ecological pyramid. How do they get their energy? They're kind of separate from our typical energy pyramid that we'll draw in a minute, because they're not really top-level predators. There's a lot of them. But for now, they basically feed on the tissue of dead organisms. Detritivores are basically things that are eating dead plants. So scavengers could be, like a bird that sees a dead animal and goes in and starts chowing down. So they're a consumer for sure, but they didn't actually kill that animal. They just are opportunistic feeders. So vultures and shrimp and crows are organisms that like to eat dead stuff. So as you eat your delicious shrimp, you gotta realize what the shrimp are actually eating, which maybe you don't want to know. Consumers, herbivores, pretty straightforward. They're going to eat plants. There's a lot of herbivores generally because there's a lot of plants or grasses to eat. They have different biology in their stomachs as opposed to us. We can't digest grass. Sometimes I wish I could and make meal planning easy. We would just serve grass for dinner. But kids probably wouldn't like that. So herbivores, you know that already, I hope. Then we have carnivores. They eat meats. And we're talking predators. The key thing you need to know is there's less of these organisms. So when compared to our herbivores, there's a lot less carnivores. And that is because of what's happening with the energy in the food pyramid, which we'll get to. And so omnivores are also another category of consumer. Bears, humans are both considered omnivores. Bears eat a lot of grass. You wouldn't really realize that. And berries, but they also eat meat as well. It's very opportunistic feeders, pretty successful. Same with us. Although some humans choose not to eat meat, obviously. We would still call them an omnivore because they have the ability to eat meat. And finally, we get to these decomposers. They are absorbing dead material, breaking it down. So decomposer versus detritivore. Decomposer doesn't really have a mouth. So decomposers are absorbing the nutrients through root systems and things like that. So the mushrooms here, they're not like moving around eating the dead stuff. They basically soak it up through their root systems, or hyphae as they're called. So energy from the sun is absorbed by the producers. Then it is transferred up through each of these. So the zebra eats the grass, doesn't obtain all of the energy, and the key point I want to make here is that there's a lot of energy lost as we move up the trophic levels. So typically when energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next, 90% of the energy is lost as heat as the organism is doing metabolism. It's very inefficient. And you know this, when you eat something, it actually helps you warm up a little bit. And that as you burn that energy, that heat is released, and if you have a jacket on, it keeps you warm. So not much goes to the next trophic level. For losing 90%, we really are only transferring 10% of the available energy. Luckily, there's a lot of energy to begin with. And it looks like this. So we've got primary producers, which is the grass or the autotrophs. Then we have primary consumers. These guys are the herbivores. Secondary consumers are organisms that eat the herbivores. And sometimes we even have a tertiary consumer that would eat the secondary consumer. And where does decomposers, where do they fit? They're not really a quaternary consumer. They are not at the top of the food chain, but they're kind of off to the side. It's a bit of a debatable point. You read different stuff from different sources about where decomposers should be, but ultimately their role is to cycle nutrients. So the energy isn't cycled back into the beginning. The energy is ultimately lost as heat. But the nutrients, the inorganic elements, those are cycled back through by the decomposers, and they play a really important role in this process. So let's take a look at this food chain here. We've got some grasshoppers eating the grass. They've been really eating my lilac bushes this year. I don't like that. And then secondary consumer, a snake might come in and eat the grass hopper, and then a hawk might come in and snag the snake. We would call the hawk a tertiary consumer. And so here's this decomposer, the fungi off to the side. So maybe the hawk dies someday and it's kind of down in the soil decomposing. You might get some decomposers, bacteria that come along and help to break down that material and return those elements, those nutrients. The nitrogen is probably the most important one, back into the soil so it can be taken up by the producers. So in addition to energy, living things also need nutrients. So energy flows through an ecosystem and nutrients cycle. I'll have a totally different lesson on how the nutrient cycles work. Here's more of a web. The last one was a bit of a chain. Take a look at this and see if you can see which level the salmon would be. Okay, so let's look at this food web here. What I want you to take a look at is this circle here, and if you can read that, that says plankton. So plankton, specifically phytoplankton, are a group of organisms that do photosynthesis. A lot of them are microscopic, and some of them are referred to as microalgae, and they generally form the basis of the food chain in the aquatic ecosystems. And the phytoplankton are consumed by a few different groups of small forage fish. So if we focus on one of them called the alewife, the alewife basically eats the plankton, so it would be a primary consumer. And then the salmon, if it's eating the alewife, would be a secondary consumer. So if you got that correct, good job. You're probably wondering, well, why is this not the basis of the food chain? These dead animals and plants that are eaten by bacteria and fungi, those kind of go through a different pathway, and we start our trophic levels at the producer level instead of the dead organism level. Here's another food web, forest/rainforest web. This one's a bit easier to see. A question might be, what's the trophic level for the lynx? Well, the lynx here is going to be eating squirrels and mice. They're the primary consumers already. Down here we have the primary producers. And so the lynx could be a secondary consumer, or if the energy went through this pathway, it might be called a tertiary consumer because it's eating possibly a weasel or fox that already ate a mouse. So sometimes the trophic level can change depending on the pathway the energy takes. And finally, one of the key ideas for this section is this ecological pyramid. So what it is, it shows the primary producers at the bottom of this pyramid, the primary consumers halfway up,